The gunshot that echoed across the frozen Montana wilderness sent a flock of crows scattering into the slate-gray sky as Rebecca Carson stumbled through deep snow, each labored breath visible in the bitter January air of 1876. Blood trailed behind her, not her own, but that of her father, who now lay dead in their ransacked cabin 5 miles back. Rebecca's bare feet had lost all feeling nearly an hour ago. The thin cotton nightgown offered little protection against the merciless winter, and the shawl she'd grabbed in her desperate flight provided scant warmth. Tears froze against her cheeks as she pushed forward, not daring to look back for fear the Blackwell gang would be there, gaining ground with each passing second. They'd come for her father's gold, the modest sum he'd saved from 3 years of backbreaking work at the Sweetwater mine. Rebecca had hidden beneath the floorboards when they broke down the door, listening to her father's futile pleas before the deafening gunshot silenced him forever. When one of the men mentioned checking the house for valuables, and the daughter they'd heard about Rebecca had slipped out the back window into the frigid night, her lungs burned from exertion and cold. Each step became increasingly difficult as the snow reached mid-calf. The forest ahead seemed to offer sanctuary, but the distance stretched impossibly far. Rebecca's vision blurred, black spots dancing before her eyes as her body began shutting down. Just a little further, she gasped, though to what destination she couldn't say. The nearest town was 20 miles away, no neighbors for at least 10. The brutal reality of her situation crashed over her as heavily as the snow falling from the laden branches above. When her legs finally gave way, Rebecca fell face first into the snow. The cold embraced her like an old friend, no longer painful but numbing, enticing her toward a sleep from which she would never wake. As consciousness began to slip away, the distant sound of hoofbeats penetrated the silence. "Too late," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed as a shadow fell across her crumpled form. Daniel Irwin had been tracking the massive elk for 3 days. The ranch needed meat to last through the remainder of winter, and he'd volunteered for the hunt despite the approaching storm. At 32, Daniel was the most experienced hunter at the Broken Spur, having spent nearly half his life in the unforgiving Montana wilderness after leaving his family's farm in Illinois. The storm had blown in earlier than expected, obscuring the elk's trail and forcing Daniel to make a difficult decision. Continuing the hunt meant risking his own life, but returning empty-handed meant hungry mouths at the ranch. As he guided his stallion Thunder through the deepening snow, the unmistakable crack of a distant gunshot carried through the crisp air. Daniel stiffened in the saddle. Hunters were rare in this weather, and the shot had come from the direction of the scattered homesteads near Sweetwater Creek. Pulling his Winchester rifle from its scabbard, he nudged Thunder toward the sound, every sense alert for danger. The tracks appeared suddenly small, bare footprints in the snow, accompanied by sporadic drops of blood. Daniel frowned beneath his thick beard, scanning the surrounding forest. Who in their right mind would be out in this weather without boots? Following the trail, his concern grew as the footprints became erratic, the person clearly struggling. When he spotted the crumpled figure ahead, Daniel spurred Thunder forward. Dismounting before the horse had fully stopped, he knelt beside what he now saw was a young woman, her nightgown soaked through, feet bare and blue with cold. "Miss, can you hear me?" Daniel gently turned her over, brushing snow from her face. She was beautiful despite her blue-tinged lips and frost-rimmed eyelashes, perhaps 20 years old, with chestnut hair that spilled across the snow. More alarming was how cold she felt to the touch. Daniel knew she had minutes, not hours, before the cold claimed her permanently. Acting quickly, he removed his heavy bearskin coat and wrapped it around her still form. He untied the bedroll from behind his saddle, spreading the woolen blanket on the ground. Next came his spare socks, thick, wool meant for the harshest conditions, which he carefully worked over her frozen feet. "Stay with me," he murmured, gathering her lightweight body into his arms. She stirred slightly at the movement, a soft moan escaping her lips. "That's it. Fight." Daniel wrapped the blanket around them both, creating a cocoon of shared warmth as he held her against his chest. He knew he couldn't risk moving her immediately. The shock could stop her heart. Instead, he would warm her gradually, using his own body heat to bring life back into her frozen limbs. "They killed him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel tensed. "Who killed who, miss? Father?" "Blackwell gang." Her words faded as unconsciousness reclaimed her. Daniel's jaw tightened. The Blackwell gang had been terrorizing the territory for months, robbing, burning, killing without consequence as the understaffed territorial marshals struggled to maintain order across the vast wilderness. If they'd attacked this woman's home, he needed to get her to safety quickly. As the afternoon light began to fade, Daniel made his decision. The temperature would drop dangerously after sunset. His own cabin was 3 hours away, too far in her condition. But Old Man Finnegan's abandoned hunting shack was less than an hour's ride. It wouldn't offer much, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and a fireplace. It would have to do. Carefully, Daniel wrapped the woman more securely in his coat and the blanket, then lifted her onto Thunder's back before mounting behind her. Holding her against his chest with one arm, he urged the horse forward, praying they'd reach shelter before the full force of the storm hit. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of warmth and movement. Strange dreams mingled with fragments of reality: her father's face, the gunshot, cold so intense it burned, and now the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the security of strong arms holding her upright. When she next opened her eyes, she found herself inside a small, dimly lit cabin. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across rough-hewn walls. She lay on a narrow cot, wrapped in several blankets, with something warm and heavy covering her feet. Panic surged through her as the memory of the past day's events rushed back. "Easy now," came a deep voice from across the room. "You're safe." Rebecca's head snapped toward the sound. A tall man stood by the fire, silhouetted against the flames. Broad-shouldered and bearded, he wore a flannel shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows as he stirred something in a pot hanging over the fire. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. "Where am I?" The man approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal, and knelt beside the cot to offer a cup of steaming liquid. "Name's Daniel Irwin. Found you collapsed in the snow about 3 hours back. This is Finnegan's old hunting cabin, closest shelter I could find." He held out the cup. "Broth, you need to warm from the inside out." Rebecca hesitated, then accepted the cup with trembling hands. The rich aroma made her realize how desperately hungry she was. As she sipped the hot liquid, she became aware of the strange sensation in her feet and glanced down to find them wrapped in bandages. "Your feet were in bad shape," Daniel explained, following her gaze. "Frostbitten, but I don't think you'll lose any toes." Been rubbing them with snow to restore circulation, then wrapped them in bandages soaked in warm water. Old Trapper taught me that trick years ago. The kindness of this stranger, this Daniel Irwin, brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm Rebecca Carson." "Carson?" Daniel's brow furrowed. "From Sweetwater Creek, Thomas Carson's daughter." Rebecca nodded, grief tightening her throat as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "They killed him, shot him right in front of me." The cup shook in her hands and Daniel gently took it before she could spill the remaining broth. "The Blackwell gang," he said grimly. "How many were there?" "4. I recognized Luther Blackwell from when he came through our settlement last fall." Rebecca shuddered at the memory. "They wanted Papa's gold from the mine. He'd been saving to send me east to my aunt in Boston." Daniel's expression darkened. "The Blackwells have been getting bolder. Marshal Cooper's been after them for months, but they know the mountains better than anyone." He paused, studying her face. "Did they see you? Would they recognize you?" Rebecca shook her head. "I don't think so. I was hidden when they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "But they know Thomas Carson had a daughter. They were looking for me when I escaped." Daniel nodded slowly. "Rest now. We'll figure things out come morning. Storm's blowing hard out there. We're not going anywhere tonight." As he moved back toward the fire, Rebecca suddenly realized something. "Your coat, your supplies, you gave everything to me. Aren't you cold?" A faint smile crossed his bearded face. "I've weathered worse." He added more wood to the fire. Sleep if you can, Miss Carson. Your body needs to recover. Despite her grief and fear, exhaustion tugged Rebecca toward unconsciousness. The last thing she saw before surrendering to sleep was Daniel Irwin's broad back as he sat vigil by the fire, his rifle across his knees, a silent promise of protection. Dawn broke with painful brightness as sunlight reflected off the snow and through the cabin's single window. Rebecca woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day crashed back into her consciousness. A fresh wave of grief washed over her as she remembered her father would never again smile at her across their breakfast table. Testing her limbs cautiously, Rebecca was surprised to find she could move without the excruciating pain she'd expected. Her feet, however, protested sharply when she attempted to flex them. Wincing, she propped herself up on one elbow and surveyed the cabin. Daniel stood at the doorway, his broad frame filling the entrance as he looked out at the snow-covered landscape. He donned a thick sheepskin vest over his flannel shirt, and his breath fogged in the cold air that seeped through the partially open door. "Storm's past," he said without turning, somehow sensing she was awake. "Left about 2 feet of fresh snow, though." Rebecca sat up fully, clutching the blankets around herself as she suddenly became aware of her state of dress. Her nightgown, while modest, was hardly appropriate attire in the presence of a man she'd just met. "Mr. Irwin," she began hesitantly, "I don't suppose. That is, my clothing." Daniel turned then, his expression unreadable beneath his beard. "Your nightgown was soaked through. I hung it to dry by the fire while you slept." A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "I didn't, that is, I preserved your modesty as best I could, wrapped you in blankets first." Despite everything, Rebecca felt a blush warm her face. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded briskly and crossed to the fire where her nightgown hung from a makeshift line. "It's dry now. I'll step outside while you dress." He handed her the garment, then collected his rifle and headed for the door. "Call when you're decent." Once alone, Rebecca quickly pulled on the nightgown, grateful for its familiar comfort despite its inadequacy against the cold. The simple act of dressing herself brought a rush of pain to her feet, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Looking down, she carefully unwrapped the bandages Daniel had applied. Her feet were mottled red and white, swollen and tender to the touch. Blisters had formed in several places, but the blue-black coloration of severe frostbite was mercifully absent. As she rewrapped the bandages, Rebecca realized how fortunate she had been. Many lost feet and hands to the Montana winters, she might have lost her life. "Mr. Irwin," she called when she was finished, "you can come back in now." Daniel returned, stamping snow from his boots. He carried an armful of firewood which he deposited beside the hearth before kneeling to stoke the flames. "How are your feet feeling?" he asked, his back to her. "Painful, but better than I expected," Rebecca admitted. "I don't think I can walk far yet." "You won't need to," Daniel replied, turning to face her. "I'll take you to my cabin once you've had something to eat. It's better equipped than this place and safer too. Then we can decide what to do about the Blackwells." Rebecca's stomach clenched at the mention of the gang. What can be done? "The territorial marshals haven't managed to catch them in months of trying." Daniel's expression hardened. "First things first, we need to notify the law about your father and get you someplace secure. The Broken Spur Ranch where I work is about 20 miles southwest of here. The foreman, Harold Jenkins, is a good man. He'll help us contact Marshal Cooper." As he spoke, Daniel set about preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack soaked in bacon grease, unappetizing under normal circumstances, but welcome to Rebecca's empty stomach. They ate in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Rebecca studied her rescuer as he drank his coffee. Daniel Irwin was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against harsh sun and snow. His beard was dark brown with flecks of auburn that caught the firelight, and his hands, wrapped around the tin cup, were calloused and strong. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, not like the dandies who occasionally passed through their settlement from the east, but there was something compelling about his quiet strength. "You're staring, Miss Carson," Daniel observed without looking up from his cup. Rebecca startled, embarrassed at being caught. "I apologize, Mr. Irwin. I was just thinking how fortunate I was that you found me." His eyes, a surprising shade of green, finally met hers. "Fortunate for us both. I'd have hated to discover what I found today was a frozen corpse instead of a living woman." The blunt words sent a shiver through Rebecca. "Do you think, will they come looking for me? The Blackwells?" Daniel considered this as he set aside his empty cup. "Hard to say. If they think you died in the snow, they'll have no reason to search, but if they suspect you survived and could identify them." He didn't need to finish the thought. "I should return home," Rebecca said suddenly. "For my father, he deserves a proper burial." Pain flashed across Daniel's features so quickly Rebecca almost missed it. "Miss Carson, your father's remains, after a night in these temperatures." Understanding dawned, and Rebecca pressed her hand to her mouth as fresh grief washed over her. The harsh reality of frontier life meant that many weren't afforded the dignity of a proper burial. The wilderness claimed its own, one way or another. "We can send men from the ranch once you're safe," Daniel offered gently. "They can recover your father's body and any belongings worth salvaging." Rebecca nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment, she composed herself enough to ask, "When do we leave?" "As soon as you feel strong enough to ride. It's about 3 hours to my cabin and another day's journey to the ranch from there." Rebecca gestured ruefully to her bandaged feet. "I'm not sure I can manage stirrups just yet." Daniel's mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. "You won't need to. You'll ride in front of me, same as yesterday." The journey to Daniel's cabin tested Rebecca's endurance more than she anticipated. Though her feet were cushioned in Daniel's spare socks and wrapped in strips of blanket, each jolt of the horse sent spikes of pain through her injured extremities. She sat sideways across the saddle, Daniel's arm secure around her waist, as thunder picked his way through the deep snow. The proximity to her rescuer brought a confusing mix of emotions. Rebecca had never been held so close by any man save her father, yet circumstances made the intimacy necessary rather than scandalous. Daniel himself maintained a respectful silence throughout most of the journey, his attention focused on guiding his mount through the treacherous terrain. By the time a small cabin came into view in a sheltered clearing, Rebecca was exhausted and feverish. The exertion and exposure had taken a greater toll than either had anticipated. Daniel's arm tightened around her as she swayed in the saddle. "Hold on," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "We're nearly there." The cabin was larger than Finnegan's hunting shack, built solidly of squared logs with a stone chimney and a small attached stable. As they approached, Rebecca noticed the careful craftsmanship, the precisely fitted corners, the gently sloped roof designed to shed snow, the shuttered windows that would keep out winter drafts. "You built this yourself?" she asked, impressed despite her discomfort. Daniel nodded. "Took 3 summers, worth every splinter." After settling Thunder in the stable with fresh hay and water, Daniel carried Rebecca into the cabin. Unlike the sparse interior of the hunting shack, Daniel's home reflected permanent habitation. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rocking chair positioned nearby. Shelves held books, a surprising luxury in the wilderness, along with various tools and supplies. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area, complete with a cast iron stove. Through a doorway, Rebecca glimpsed a bedroom with a proper bed frame. Daniel set her gently on the rocking chair and quickly built a fire, the practiced movements suggesting a routine performed countless times. Once flames licked at the dry wood, he filled a kettle with water from a barrel by the door and set it on the stove. "You need a proper meal and rest," he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Without the hat, his dark hair fell in waves to his collar, longer than fashion dictated but practical for the cold climate. "And I should check your feet again." Rebecca nodded wearily, too drained to argue. The fever made her thoughts sluggish, and she found herself drifting despite the pain. Daniel's expression creased with concern as he laid the back of his hand against her forehead. You're burning up, Miss Carson. The exposure and shock your body's fighting back now. He disappeared into the bedroom, returning with a cotton nightshirt that would swallow her slight frame. My spare sleeping shirt, clean at least. He set it beside her with a look of apology. I'm afraid I have no women's clothing to offer you. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have been mortified at the impropriety of wearing a man's nightshirt. Now she merely felt grateful for fresh clothing. Thank you for everything. Daniel nodded awkwardly, then busied himself preparing a meal while Rebecca gathered her strength. When he next turned to her, he held a steaming bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. Venison and potato, he explained, setting it on the small table beside the rocker. Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in your bones. The rich aroma made Rebecca's stomach growl appreciatively. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until food was before her. As she ate, Daniel took a basin of warm water and knelt before her, gently unwrapping the makeshift bandages from her feet. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-roughened hands. Rebecca watched as he examined her feet with clinical detachment, yet obvious concern. The circulation's returning, he observed, carefully bathing each foot in the warm water. You'll have pain for a while yet and some blistering, but I don't see any signs of deep frostbite. You're lucky. Rebecca winced as he probed a particularly tender spot. Doesn't feel especially lucky at the moment. A chuckle rumbled from Daniel's chest, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. The sound transformed his face, softening the weathered lines and bringing warmth to his eyes. Fair point, Miss Carson. Rebecca, she corrected him softly. After all you've done for me, I think formality seems rather unnecessary. Daniel looked up, surprise evident in his expression. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. Rebecca, then, and I'm Daniel. The simple exchange felt momentous somehow, as though they'd crossed some invisible boundary. Rebecca attributed the sudden fluttering in her chest to fever rather than the way Daniel's eyes lingered on her face before returning to his task. After rebandaging her feet with proper cotton strips from his medical supplies, Daniel helped Rebecca to the bedroom. You take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. Too exhausted to protest, Rebecca sank gratefully onto the mattress. The sheets smelled of pine and wood smoke Daniel's scent, and the pillow was softer than expected. I'll just rest my eyes a moment, she murmured, already drifting toward sleep. The last thing she remembered was Daniel drawing a quilt over her, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they tucked the fabric around her shoulders. Fever dreams tormented Rebecca throughout the night, visions of her father calling for help, of Luther Blackwell's snarling face as he fired his pistol, of endless white snow stained with blood. Each time she surfaced from the nightmares, gasping and disoriented, Daniel was there with a cool cloth for her forehead and quiet reassurances. By dawn, the fever had broken, leaving Rebecca weak but clear-headed. She woke to find sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. For one blessed moment, she forgot the tragedy that had brought her here, then reality crashed back, bringing fresh grief that caught in her throat. Footsteps approached the bedroom door, followed by a gentle knock. Rebecca, are you awake? Yes, she called, her voice hoarse from sleep and sorrow. Daniel entered carrying a cup of steaming tea. He'd shaved, she noticed, his beard trimmed neater than before, revealing a strong jaw and the hint of a dimple in his right cheek. The transformation was surprising. Beneath the wilderness roughness lay a handsome face. How are you feeling? He asked, handing her the tea. Rebecca accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. Better, the fever's gone. Good, Daniel nodded, seemingly relieved. I was concerned. Exposure can turn deadly quick out here, even after you're seemingly recovered. Rebecca sipped her tea sweetened with honey, she noted with surprise. Such small luxuries were rare in the Montana territory. You didn't sleep much, did you, because of me? Daniel shrugged off her concern. I've gone without sleep before. The casual dismissal of his own comfort struck Rebecca anew. This man had saved her life, surrendered his bed, tended her through fever dreams, and acted as though it were nothing extraordinary. I'm not sure I can ever repay your kindness, she said softly. Something flickered in Daniel's eyes, discomfort, perhaps at her gratitude. No debt between us, he cleared his throat. Think you can manage some breakfast, then we should talk about what comes next. Rebecca nodded, suddenly aware of her appearance after a night of fever. She must look a fright, hair tangled, face drawn with exhaustion and grief. Might I? Is there somewhere I could freshen up first? Daniel pointed to a washstand in the corner of the bedroom she hadn't noticed before. Fresh water in the pitcher, take your time. I'll have food ready when you're done. Once alone, Rebecca carefully swung her legs over the side of the bed, testing her injured feet. Pain shot through them immediately, but it was duller than before, a deep ache rather than sharp agony. Using the bedpost for support, she stood cautiously, putting minimal weight on her feet as she hobbled to the washstand. The face that greeted her in the small mirror above the basin was barely recognizable. Hollowed cheeks, dark circles beneath bloodshot eyes, and tangled hair that resembled a bird's nest more than the neat chestnut waves she normally maintained. Rebecca sighed, dipping a cloth into the cool water and beginning the process of making herself presentable. By the time she emerged from the bedroom, leaning heavily on a walking stick Daniel had evidently left by the door for her use, she felt marginally more human. She'd managed to work the worst tangles from her hair using her fingers as a makeshift comb, and the cool water had brought some color back to her cheeks. Daniel glanced up from the stove, where he tended a pan of frying bacon. His eyes widened slightly at her appearance, then quickly returned to his task. Sit, he said, gesturing to the table where he'd already set places for two. Food's nearly ready. Rebecca eased herself onto the chair, propping the walking stick against the table edge. Thank you for this, she said, indicating the stick. It helps tremendously. Old broomstick, Daniel admitted, transferring bacon to two plates already containing cornbread, but it'll do until you're steady again. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. Rebecca found herself unexpectedly hungry, the simple fare tasting better than any fancy dinner she could recall. When she'd finished, she sat back with a sigh, cradling a cup of coffee between her palms. So, Daniel said at last, meeting her eyes across the table. We need to decide what happens next. Rebecca nodded, throat tightening at the reminder of her situation. I suppose we should notify the marshal about my father, and she paused, considering her options. I have an aunt in Boston. Father wanted me to go to her eventually. I suppose now I must. Daniel's expression remained neutral, though something like disappointment flickered briefly in his eyes. Boston's a long way from Montana territory. Expensive journey, too. Father had saved money, Rebecca said, then grimaced. Though I suppose the Blackwells have that now, along with anything else of value from our home. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. First things first, we need to get word to Marshal Cooper about what happened. From my cabin, it's a day's ride to the Broken Spur Ranch, and another half-day to Silverdale where the marshal's office is located. He hesitated. You're in no condition to travel that far yet. Your feet need more time to heal. I can't impose on you further, Rebecca protested, though the thought of traveling on her injured feet filled her with dread. It's no imposition, Daniel said firmly. You'll stay here while I ride to the ranch. I can send word to the marshal from there and arrange for men to see to your father's remains. He hesitated before adding, the ranch owner's wife, Mrs. Jenkins, might have clothing she could spare for you as well. Rebecca looked down at the oversized nightshirt she still wore, her cheeks warming. That would be appreciated. I should leave today, Daniel continued, rising to clear their plates. With luck, I can reach the ranch by nightfall and return tomorrow with supplies. Will you be all right here alone? The prospect of solitude after the trauma she'd experienced made Rebecca's chest tighten with anxiety, but she forced a brave nod. Of course, I'll be fine. Daniel studied her face, clearly reading the fear she tried to hide. The cabin is secure, door has a strong bolt. There's a loaded shotgun by the bed. Can you use one? Father taught me, Rebecca confirmed. Shooting had been a necessary skill for survival in the territory, not a mere pastime. Good. Daniel seemed satisfied. I'll leave you with plenty of firewood and food. Stay inside, keep the fire going, and rest those feet. The Blackwells have no reason to come this direction. They operate mainly to the north and east. His practical assessment calmed Rebecca's fears somewhat. How soon will you leave? Within the hour. Sooner I go, sooner I return. Daniel hesitated, then added, I don't like leaving you alone so soon after your ordeal, but getting word to the marshal about the Blackwells might prevent them from hurting others. The reminder of her father's killers still roaming free steeled Rebecca's resolve. Go, I'll manage here. As Daniel prepared for his journey, gathering supplies and checking his weapons, Rebecca watched from the rocking chair by the fire. Despite having known him less than 2 days, the thought of his departure left her feeling oddly bereft. He had become her anchor in a world suddenly turned upside down. Before leaving, Daniel showed her where everything was located: food stores, extra blankets, medical supplies, ammunition for the shotgun. He brought in enough firewood to last several days and left a bucket of fresh water within easy reach of the rocking chair. I'll be back by tomorrow evening at the latest, he promised, donning his heavy coat and hat. Bolt the door behind me. Rebecca nodded, leaning on the walking stick as she accompanied him to the door. Be careful, she said softly. Daniel paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a current of connection neither had anticipated. Then he nodded briskly and was gone, the cold air swirling in briefly before Rebecca closed and bolted the door as instructed. The silence that fell over the cabin was profound. After the constant companionship of her father throughout her life, followed by Daniel's steady presence these past 2 days, being truly alone felt strange and unsettling. Rebecca returned to the rocking chair, drawing a blanket over her lap as she stared into the crackling fire. For the first time since her desperate flight through the snow, she had space to truly process what had happened. Grief washed over her in waves, the finality of her father's death becoming real in a way it hadn't before. She wept openly, no longer needing to be brave for Daniel's benefit, the sobs racking her body until exhaustion claimed her once more. When Rebecca woke, shadows had lengthened across the cabin floor, indicating several hours had passed. The fire had burned low, and she carefully added more logs as Daniel had shown her. Her feet throbbed dully as she moved, but the pain was manageable with the walking stick's support. Hunger eventually drove her to the kitchen area, where she found bread, cheese, and dried apple slices Daniel had left for her. As she ate, Rebecca contemplated her future. Boston seemed the only logical choice. Her father's sister Emily had written occasionally over the years, always including an open invitation for Rebecca to join her in civilization. The prospect had never appealed to Rebecca before. She'd loved the wild beauty of Montana despite its hardships. Now, with her father gone and their homestead destroyed, what reason had she to stay? Yet something held her back from embracing the idea wholeheartedly. She told herself it was merely the shock of recent events, that she needed time to heal before making such a momentous decision. But as evening settled over the cabin and Rebecca prepared for sleep in Daniel's comfortable bed, she found herself hoping he would return sooner rather than later, bringing more than just supplies from the ranch. The day of solitude stretched into 2 as a fresh snowfall delayed Daniel's return. Rebecca occupied herself with small tasks that didn't strain her healing feet, mending a shirt of Daniel's with a needle and thread she'd found in a drawer, organizing the surprisingly extensive collection of books that filled one shelf, and preparing simple meals from the provisions he'd left. By the afternoon of the second day, worry had begun to gnaw at her. What if something had happened to him? What if the Blackwells had somehow found him on the trail? What if the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her spiraling thoughts? Rebecca's heart leaped to her throat as she grabbed the shotgun from beside the bed. It could be Daniel, or it could be trouble. Keeping the weapon ready, she peered through a crack in the shutters. Relief flooded through her at the sight of Daniel's broad-shouldered figure atop Thunder, accompanied by a second horse pulling a small sledge loaded with supplies. Rebecca set aside the shotgun and unlocked the door, stepping onto the porch despite her painful feet. The smile that spread across her face at the sight of him surprised even her with its intensity. Daniel dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his large frame. His face, wind-burned and weary from travel, brightened noticeably when he saw her waiting. "You shouldn't be on your feet," he admonished, though the concern in his voice held no real reproach. "I was worried," Rebecca admitted. "The snow slowed me down considerably," Daniel confirmed, leading Thunder toward the stable. "Sorry to cause you concern. Let me tend to the horses, then I'll bring everything in." Rebecca returned to the warmth of the cabin, her heart inexplicably lighter knowing Daniel had returned safely. When he finally came through the door, arms laden with parcels, she had coffee waiting for him. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he said, stamping snow from his boots before setting down his burdens. "How are you faring? Feet healing?" "Better each day," Rebecca confirmed, pouring him coffee. "What news from the ranch? Were you able to contact Marshal Cooper?" Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully, warming his hands around the mug before answering. "Cooper was actually at the ranch when I arrived, pure luck. He'd stopped on his way back from investigating another Blackwell robbery near Helena." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "And what did he say about my father?" Daniel's expression softened with sympathy. "He's sending men to your homestead today. They'll take care of your father properly, Rebecca, and Cooper's gathering a posse to hunt down the Blackwells." Your description of the men involved gave him something concrete to work with. Relief and renewed grief warred within Rebecca as she sank into the rocking chair. "Thank you," she whispered, eyes filling with tears. Daniel busied himself unpacking the supplies he'd brought, giving her a moment to compose herself. "Mrs. Jenkins sent clothing," he said, indicating a cloth-wrapped bundle, "and food. The ranch hands collected some money for you as well once they heard what happened." The unexpected kindness from strangers brought fresh tears. I don't know what to say. Frontier folk look after their own," Daniel said simply. "Speaking of which, Mrs. Jenkins invited you to stay at the ranch once you're able to travel. She said a young woman shouldn't be alone in these circumstances." Rebecca wiped her eyes, considering this. "That's very kind of her," Daniel nodded, continuing to unpack supplies. "There's something else," he said, his back to her as he arranged canned goods on a shelf. "Marshal Cooper asked me about your plans. I mentioned your aunt in Boston." "What did he say?" Rebecca asked, curious about Daniel's suddenly careful tone. "He thinks it's wise, you leaving the territory." Daniel's voice was studiously neutral. "The Blackwells might come looking for you once they realize you survived to identify them. Boston would be safer." Rebecca studied Daniel's broad back, noting the tension in his shoulders. "And what do you think?" she asked softly. Daniel turned to face her then, his expression unreadable. "I think you should do whatever brings you peace, Rebecca. If that's Boston, then so be it." Something in his carefully measured response told Rebecca there was more he wasn't saying. Before she could press further, Daniel changed the subject. "You should look through the clothing Mrs. Jenkins sent. There's a dress you could wear to your father's funeral. Marshal Cooper said they'd hold the service in Silverdale once they've brought him in." His voice gentled. "The whole community wants to pay respects. Your father was well regarded." Fresh grief tightened Rebecca's throat. The reality of a funeral made her loss tangible in a new way. "When?" "4 days from now, weather permitting." Daniel hesitated before adding, "I'll take you if you'll allow it." "Thank you," Rebecca managed, touched by his continued kindness. "I'd appreciate that." As evening settled over the cabin, they shared a meal of hearty stew Mrs. Jenkins had sent. Daniel recounted news from the ranch and town, carefully keeping the conversation light to distract Rebecca from her grief. It was only when they'd finished eating and sat before the fire, Rebecca in the rocking chair and Daniel on a wooden stool, that he broached a more serious topic. "Rebecca," he began, his voice low and measured, "there's something I should tell you about the Blackwells." The sudden gravity in his tone made Rebecca sit straighter. "What is it?" Daniel stared into the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "They've killed before. Many times, but usually drifters, miners, people passing through folks without connections or anyone to identify them." He paused. Your father was different, a respected homesteader with friends in the community, you surviving to identify them. It changes things. How so? Rebecca asked, though dread pooled in her stomach at his expression. Marshall Cooper believes they'll be desperate to silence you. If they learn you survived, Daniel met her eyes directly, they'll hunt you down, Rebecca, not just for revenge, but for self-preservation. The blunt assessment sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the winter night outside. So Boston truly is my only option. Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. Perhaps, for now at least. Rebecca studied his face, sensing again that he held something back. Daniel, please speak plainly. There's something else troubling you about this situation, isn't there? A muscle worked in Daniel's jaw as he considered her request. Finally, he sighed. It's not just about your safety, though that concerns me greatly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Rebecca had come to recognize as signaling his discomfort. In the 2 days you've been here, I've come to care what happens to you, more than I should, perhaps, given our brief acquaintance. The admission hung in the air between them, fraught with unspoken implications. Rebecca's heart quickened as she realized what Daniel was trying to say. I feel it too, she said softly. This connection between us, it seems impossible given the circumstances, yet it's there nonetheless. Relief flickered across Daniel's features, followed immediately by renewed concern. Which makes the thought of you leaving for Boston all the more difficult to contemplate. Yet I cannot in good conscience ask you to stay, knowing the danger it would place you in. Rebecca leaned forward, wincing slightly as the movement jostled her tender feet. Perhaps we're thinking too far ahead. For now, let us focus on the immediate future: my father's funeral, my recovery. Boston can wait until we know more about the Blackwell's whereabouts and intentions. Daniel nodded slowly, clearly still troubled but willing to accept her suggestion. You're right, one day at a time. He stood, stretching his tall frame. You should rest. Tomorrow I'll check your feet again, see how they're healing. As he moved toward the door where he'd arranged his bedroll, Rebecca called after him. Daniel. When he turned, she continued hesitantly, Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for being honest with me, for treating me as someone capable of making her own decisions, not a helpless female to be protected from harsh truths. A small smile touched Daniel's lips. You're the furthest thing from helpless I've ever encountered, Rebecca Carson. Any woman who can run barefoot through snow to escape killers has more courage than most men I've known. His words warmed something deep within Rebecca, a spark of pride that helped offset the grief and fear that had dominated her emotions since that terrible night. As she prepared for sleep in Daniel's comfortable bed, she found herself contemplating a future that might include more than just survival, one that might, against all odds, contain happiness again. The morning of Thomas Carson's funeral dawned clear and cold. Rebecca stood before the small mirror in Daniel's bedroom, adjusting the black woolen dress Mrs. Jenkins had sent. It fit reasonably well, though it hung slightly loose on Rebecca's frame, which had grown thinner in the week since her ordeal. Her feet had healed enough to wear soft leather boots, though walking remained painful. Daniel had fashioned insoles from rabbit fur to cushion each step, his nimble fingers crafting the unexpected comfort with surprising skill. During the past days, they'd fallen into an easy routine, sharing meals, talking late into the evening, discovering common interests despite their different backgrounds. Daniel had been raised on an Illinois farm before the war took his father and older brother, leaving him to seek his fortune in the West at 17. Rebecca had grown up in Boston until her mother's death when she was 12, after which her father had taken her west, seeking both fortune and escape from painful memories. Their growing closeness remained unspoken yet undeniable, evident in small gestures: Daniel's hand steadying her elbow when she walked, Rebecca's fingers lingering when passing him coffee, shared glances across the table that conveyed more than words could express. Ready. Daniel's voice came from the doorway, pulling Rebecca from her thoughts. She turned to find him dressed in his finest clothes, a dark wool suit that, while well worn, had been carefully brushed and pressed. He'd trimmed his beard again and slicked back his hair, transforming himself from rugged frontiersman to a gentleman any Eastern family would find presentable. "As ready as I'll ever be," Rebecca replied, reaching for the black shawl that completed her mourning attire. Daniel stepped forward, taking the shawl from her hands and gently placing it around her shoulders. The simple gesture felt intimate somehow, his fingers brushing against her neck as he arranged the fabric. "You look beautiful," he said softly, then immediately seemed to regret the comment. "I apologize, that's hardly appropriate today." "No apologies needed," Rebecca assured him, touched by both the compliment and his concern for propriety. "Thank you." The journey to Silverdale took most of the morning. Daniel had borrowed a wagon from the Broken Spur, making the trip easier on Rebecca's healing feet than horseback would have been. They traveled in companionable silence for much of the way, each lost in their own thoughts as the vast Montana landscape unfolded around them. Silverdale was little more than a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single street, but today it seemed the entire settlement had turned out. Wagons and horses lined the thoroughfare, and somber-faced men and women in their Sunday best stood conversing in hushed tones outside the small white church that served the community. As Daniel helped Rebecca from the wagon, she felt the weight of curious stares. News traveled fast in frontier communities, and everyone would know her story by now, the daughter who escaped the Blackwell gang while her father was murdered. "Chin up," Daniel murmured, offering his arm for support. "These are good people who respected your father. They're here to help, not gawk." Rebecca nodded, grateful for his steadying presence as they made their way toward the church. Before they reached the steps, a tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached, hat in hand. "Miss Carson, I'm Marshal James Cooper." His weathered face creased with sympathy beneath a shock of gray hair. "My deepest condolences for your loss. Your father was a fine man." "Thank you, Marshal," Rebecca replied, finding strength in Daniel's solid presence beside her. "Have you any news of the men who killed him?" Cooper's expression darkened. "Nothing concrete yet, but we're following every lead. The Blackwells won't escape justice this time, I give you my word on that." He glanced at Daniel. "Irwin has told you our concerns about your safety." "Yes," Rebecca confirmed. "Though I haven't decided yet whether Boston is necessary." Cooper's bushy eyebrows rose slightly as he glanced between Rebecca and Daniel, clearly noting their closeness. "Well, no rush on decisions today. Let's get through the service first. Reverend Phillips is ready when you are." The church filled quickly, many attendees standing along the walls once the pews were full. Rebecca sat in the front row, Daniel beside her, as Reverend Phillips spoke of Thomas Carson's courage, kindness, and dedication to building a life in the territory. Several community members shared memories, Thomas helping raise a neighbor's barn, Thomas organizing the Christmas celebration the previous year, Thomas teaching the settlement children to fish in Sweetwater Creek. Each story revealed facets of her father Rebecca hadn't fully appreciated before, painting a picture of a man deeply integrated into and valued by his community. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks, but they held as much pride as grief. When it came time for Rebecca to speak, Daniel helped her to the front of the church. Drawing strength from his supportive presence, she shared her own memories, her father teaching her to shoot, to ride, to survive in this beautiful but unforgiving land. How he'd read poetry by lamplight in their cabin during long winter evenings, maintaining a connection to the cultured life they'd left behind in Boston. "My father believed in building something meaningful," she concluded, her voice steady despite her tears. "Not just a homestead, but a community. He found purpose here that eluded him back east. For that alone, I will always be grateful to this place and its people, regardless of what the future holds." The burial followed in the small cemetery behind the church. As her father's simple pine coffin was lowered into the frozen ground, Rebecca felt Daniel's arm slip around her waist, supporting her both physically and emotionally. She leaned into his strength, no longer concerned about propriety or appearances. In that moment, his presence was all that kept her standing, After the final prayers, community members approached one by one to offer condolences and support. Mrs. Jenkins, a plump, maternal woman with kind eyes, embraced Rebecca warmly. "You'll come stay with us at the ranch," she insisted, her tone brooking no argument. No young woman should be alone after such an ordeal. Before Rebecca could respond, Marshal Cooper joined them, his expression grave. "Mrs. Jenkins is right, Miss Carson. And I've received troubling news that makes your situation more urgent." He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Perhaps we could speak privately." Daniel's arm tightened protectively around Rebecca's waist. "Whatever you have to say, Marshal, you can say in front of me." Cooper assessed them both before nodding slowly. "Very well. One of my deputies returned from Helena yesterday. There's word the Blackwells are asking questions about Thomas Carson's daughter specifically, whether she survived that night." A chill ran through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the winter air. "They know I escaped, they suspect," Cooper corrected, "which means you're in danger as long as you remain in the territory. I strongly advise making arrangements for Boston as soon as possible. Mrs. Jenkins clutched Rebecca's hand. "All the more reason to come to the ranch immediately, dear. We have men who can protect you until travel arrangements are made." Rebecca glanced up at Daniel, finding his expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in his jaw. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," she said, returning her attention to the older woman. "Your offer is incredibly kind, but—" She hesitated, gathering her courage. "I believe I'll be safer continuing to stay with Mr. Irwin until arrangements can be finalized." Surprise flickered across Mrs. Jenkins's face, followed by understanding as she observed the protective way Daniel stood beside Rebecca. "Of course, dear, whatever you think best." She patted Rebecca's hand. "Though perhaps you might consider having a woman's company during this difficult time." Before Rebecca could respond, Daniel spoke. "Perhaps Mrs. Foster could stay with us," he addressed Cooper. "She's a widow who lives near my cabin. Respectable woman, keeps to herself mostly." Cooper nodded thoughtfully. "Maddie Foster, good idea, I'll speak with her today." He turned to Rebecca. "Meanwhile, I'll telegraph your aunt in Boston if you'll provide her direction. The sooner arrangements are made, the better." The practicality of these discussions, the inevitable momentum toward her departure, made Rebecca's chest tighten with conflicting emotions. She provided her aunt's address mechanically, all while acutely aware of Daniel's growing silence beside her. As they prepared to leave Silverdale later that afternoon, Rebecca found a moment alone with Daniel while he readied the wagon. "You've been quiet," she observed, studying his profile as he checked the harness. Daniel's hands stilled, though he didn't look at her. "Just thinking." "About," Rebecca pressed gently. A sigh escaped him as he finally met her gaze. "About how quickly life changes. A week ago I was tracking an elk through the snow. Now," he gestured vaguely between them. "Now everything's different, because of me," Rebecca said softly. "Because of circumstances neither of us controlled," Daniel corrected. His expression softened as he looked at her. "I don't regret finding you in that snow, Rebecca, not for a single moment." The simple declaration carried weight beyond its words. Rebecca stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "Nor do I regret being found by you." For a breath, they stood together in perfect understanding, the busy street around them fading to insignificance. Then reality intruded as Marshal Cooper approached with news that Mrs. Foster had agreed to stay at Daniel's cabin as a chaperone, preserving Rebecca's reputation while arrangements for Boston proceeded. The ride back to Daniel's cabin was quieter than the journey to town had been, each lost in thoughts of an uncertain future. When they arrived, Mrs. Foster was already there, a sturdy woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and practical clothing. She had brought supplies and immediately set about preparing dinner, her no-nonsense efficiency both comforting and slightly intimidating. "You two look exhausted," she observed, shooing them toward the fire. "Sit, I'll handle this." Too drained to argue, Rebecca sank gratefully into the rocking chair while Daniel took his customary stool nearby. Mrs. Foster bustled about the kitchen area, the domestic sounds creating an illusion of normalcy that belied the emotional complexity of the day. She reminds me of my mother, Daniel murmured, watching Mrs. Foster with a small smile. Same way of taking charge. I like her, Rebecca decided, appreciating the older woman's straightforward manner, though I suspect she'll keep us firmly in line. Daniel's smile widened. No doubt about that. His expression grew serious again. Rebecca, about Boston, she held up a hand, stopping him. Not tonight. Please, today was difficult enough without thinking about what comes next. Understanding crossed Daniel's features, and he nodded. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow came too quickly, bringing with it practical discussions about Rebecca's journey east. Mrs. Foster proved invaluable, helping organize what Rebecca would need and offering sensible advice about traveling alone as a young woman. Marshal Cooper arrived mid-morning with news that he'd received a reply from Rebecca's aunt, who was delighted at the prospect of her niece joining her and would send funds for the journey immediately. The stage to Helena leaves Silverdale next Wednesday, Cooper informed them as they sat around Daniel's table. From there, you can take the train to St. Louis, then east to Boston. Should take about 2 weeks, barring delays. Wednesday, less than a week away. The finality of actual travel plans made Rebecca's stomach clench with anxiety. She glanced at Daniel, who sat silently across the table, his expression unreadable. What about the Blackwells? He asked Cooper, his voice low and controlled. Any progress tracking them down? Cooper shook his head grimly. Nothing solid yet. More reason to get Miss Carson to safety as quickly as possible. He turned to Rebecca. Your aunt's home in Boston will be the safest place for you until this is resolved. Once the Blackwells are captured, you can always return if you wish. If you wish. The casual phrase echoed in Rebecca's mind as Cooper continued discussing practical matters. Would she wish to return? What would be left for her here with her father gone, their homestead destroyed? Yet the thought of never again seeing the vast Montana sky, the snow-capped mountains, the wild beauty that had become home over these past years. Never again seeing Daniel. Miss Carson, Cooper's voice broke through her thoughts. Do you understand the arrangements? Rebecca nodded quickly, forcing herself to focus. Yes, thank you, Marshal. You've been very kind. After Cooper departed, Mrs. Foster tactfully busied herself with laundry outside, leaving Rebecca and Daniel alone in the cabin for the first time since before the funeral. So, Daniel said after a long silence. Boston. Rebecca nodded, unable to form words past the tightness in her throat. It's for the best, he continued, though his tone lacked conviction. Your aunt sounds pleased to have you, and Cooper's right, you'll be safe there. Safe, Rebecca echoed. Yes, she looked up, meeting his gaze directly. But is safety all that matters in life, Daniel? My father came west seeking more than safety, so did you. Daniel's jaw tightened. Your father didn't have killers specifically hunting him. The situation is different. For now, Rebecca acknowledged. But Marshal Cooper said once the Blackwells are caught, I could return if I wished. She hesitated, gathering her courage. Would you want me to return? The directness of her question clearly caught Daniel off guard. He stood abruptly, moving to stare out the window, his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. What I want doesn't matter. I'm a ranch hand with a small cabin and few prospects. You're a young woman with education and family back east. Our worlds don't align, Rebecca. The practical assessment stung more than Rebecca expected. That wasn't what I asked, Daniel. He turned then, his expression pained. What do you want me to say? That in the span of a week, I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. That the thought of you leaving tears me apart inside. That I've imagined a future where you stay, where we build something together. Would saying any of that change the reality of your situation? It might, Rebecca said softly, rising from her chair to approach him. It might change everything. Daniel shook his head, though he didn't step away as she drew near. I won't be the reason you put yourself in danger. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because I selfishly asked you to stay. And what if I decided to return once the danger passed? Rebecca pressed, standing before him now, close enough to see the conflict raging in his eyes. What then, Daniel? His hands moved to her shoulders, gentle yet firm. Then I would be waiting, he admitted, the words seeming to cost him greatly. But I won't ask that of you, Rebecca. Boston will offer opportunities and comforts Montana territory never could. You might find you prefer that life." Rebecca placed her hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. "Or I might find that what matters most to me isn't comfort or opportunity, but something far more precious that I've discovered here." For a heartbeat, they stood suspended in possibility, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, inevitably, Daniel lowered his head as Rebecca raised her face to his. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, conveying all the emotions words had failed to express. When they finally parted, Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I shouldn't have done that," he murmured, though he made no move to release her. "I'm glad you did," Rebecca replied, her fingers now entwined with his. "It makes things clearer, doesn't it?" Before Daniel could respond, the cabin door opened as Mrs. Foster returned with the dried laundry. The older woman took in their proximity with a raised eyebrow but said nothing as they quickly stepped apart. The days that followed passed in a strange limbo. Outwardly, preparations for Rebecca's journey continued. Clothing was mended, supplies gathered, arrangements confirmed. Yet beneath these practical activities ran an undercurrent of growing certainty for Rebecca, even as the date of her departure drew nearer. She and Daniel found brief moments of privacy, walks to check rabbit snares, evenings by the fire after Mrs. Foster retired to the bedroom. Rebecca now slept on a pallet near the hearth. During these stolen interludes, their connection deepened through conversations about hopes and dreams, shared laughter, and increasingly passionate embraces. "I could request a land grant," Daniel confided one evening as they sat on the porch, bundled against the cold. "Build a proper house, not just a bachelor's cabin. The Broken Spur pays well, and I've saved most of my wages these past years." Rebecca's heart quickened at the implications of his words. "What sort of house would you build?" "2 stories, he replied without hesitation, as though he'd given it considerable thought. "Proper kitchen, separate parlor, 3 bedrooms upstairs." His eyes met hers in the moonlight. "Room to grow into." The vision he painted was tantalizing, a life built together, children running across wide open spaces, the beauty of Montana as their backdrop. Yet the specter of the Blackwells loomed over these dreams, a harsh reminder of reality. The day before Rebecca was scheduled to leave for Silverdale, from where she would catch the stage to Helena, Marshal Cooper arrived with news that changed everything. "They've been spotted," he announced without preamble as he entered the cabin. "The Blackwells, all 4 of them, were seen crossing into Wyoming territory yesterday. My counterpart there has a posse on their trail." Hope surged within Rebecca. "Does that mean they've given up looking for me?" Cooper's weathered face revealed cautious optimism. "Possibly. More likely they're lying low until the heat dies down, but it does mean immediate danger has passed." He studied Rebecca intently. "However, I still think Boston would be safest until they're actually captured." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Daniel, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the spark of hope in his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Marshal," she said slowly, "but perhaps I might delay my departure, just until we know more." Cooper's gaze shifted between Rebecca and Daniel, understanding dawning in his eyes. "I see," he said after a moment. "Well, your aunt's funds won't go to waste. They'll keep at the bank until needed, and Mrs. Jenkins's offer of hospitality at the ranch still stands if you'd prefer more. Proper accommodations than Mr. Irwin's cabin. Mrs. Foster has been a wonderful chaperone," Rebecca assured him quickly. "I'm quite comfortable with the current arrangement, at least for now." Later, after Cooper had departed with promises to send word of any developments regarding the Blackwells, Daniel found Rebecca standing by the corral, watching as the winter sun set in a blaze of orange and pink behind the distant mountains. "You're staying," he said simply, coming to stand beside her. Rebecca nodded, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "For now, until we know for certain about the Blackwells." "And after that," Daniel's voice held carefully restrained hope. Rebecca turned to face him, no longer hesitant about what she wanted. After that depends on whether a certain ranch hand still plans to build that two-story house he described. The smile that spread across Daniel's face transformed his usually solemn features. He does, Daniel confirmed, drawing her into his arms, though there might be a change of plans. Oh, Rebecca raised an eyebrow, settling comfortably against his chest. Might need to build it sooner rather than later, he murmured against her hair. If a certain young woman would consider becoming his wife, joy bubbled up within Rebecca, unexpected yet perfect after the grief and fear of recent weeks. She would, she whispered, lifting her face to his. She most definitely would. Their kiss sealed the promise between them, a future forged from adversity, a love discovered in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the last light faded from the sky, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana heaven, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Spring came to Montana territory in fits and starts, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, muddy roads that froze overnight, wildflowers pushing through patches of lingering snow. By early May, the transformation was complete, the landscape erupting in vibrant green and colorful blooms. Rebecca stood on the porch of the small church in Silverdale, a bouquet of fresh wildflowers clutched in trembling hands. Inside, friends and neighbors had gathered. The Jenkins family from the Broken Spur, Mrs. Foster, Marshall Cooper, and various townspeople who had supported her through the difficult winter months. Ready, Mrs. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, her motherly face alight with happiness. Rebecca nodded, smoothing the skirt of her new dress, not the traditional white wedding gown of Eastern brides, but a pale blue creation Mrs. Jenkins and the ranch women had helped her sew, embellished with delicate embroidery around the collar and cuffs. Nervous. The older woman asked kindly, adjusting a stray lock of Rebecca's hair. A little, Rebecca admitted, but not about marrying Daniel. That decision, made in the depths of winter, had only grown more certain as spring approached and the bond between them deepened. What had begun as gratitude and attraction had blossomed into profound love, nurtured through shared work and quiet evenings, through plans made and dreams shared. Daniel had proven himself not just brave and kind, but thoughtful, intelligent, and possessed of a dry humor that never failed to make Rebecca smile even on her darkest days. The Blackwells remained at large, though reports placed them far to the south in Colorado territory. Marshall Cooper had assured them both that the danger had passed. At least for now, the gang would be fools to return to Montana, where every lawman knew their descriptions, and the bounty on their heads had tripled. Well then, Mrs. Jenkins said, breaking into Rebecca's thoughts, let's not keep that man of yours waiting any longer. He looks about ready to wear a hole in the floorboards. Inside the church, Daniel stood at the altar, tall and handsome in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. When Rebecca appeared at the back of the church on Marshall Cooper's arm, the lawman having offered to give her away in her father's stead, Daniel's expression of wonder and love made her heart swell with joy. The ceremony was simple and brief, Reverend Phillips officiating with the same warmth he'd shown at Thomas Carson's funeral. Now, however, his words celebrated beginnings rather than endings, hope rather than grief. When Daniel placed the simple gold band on Rebecca's finger, purchased with his carefully saved wages, his hands were steady, his voice clear as he repeated the vows that would bind them together. I, Daniel James Irwin, take thee, Rebecca Ann Carson, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Rebecca's own voice trembled slightly with emotion as she spoke her promises in return. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel's kiss was both tender and passionate, bringing a chorus of good-natured cheers from those gathered. The celebration afterward was held at the Broken Spur Ranch, Mrs. Jenkins having insisted on hosting the wedding feast. Tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted venison and beef, fresh baked bread, early vegetables from kitchen gardens, and a magnificent cake that had required precious imported sugar and the combined efforts of several ranch wives. As afternoon turned to evening, Rebecca found herself momentarily alone, watching as Daniel conversed with Marshall Cooper across the yard. The sight of her husband, how strange and wonderful that word seemed, filled her with contentment she had never expected to find after the tragedy that had brought them together. "Your father would be proud," came a voice beside her. Mrs. Foster had approached silently, a small package in her weathered hands. "Thomas always wanted happiness for you above all else," Rebecca smiled, blinking back tears. "I wish he could have known Daniel. He would have approved," Mrs. Foster assured her. "A man who wraps a woman's frozen feet and risks his life to protect her, that's the kind of son-in-law any father would welcome." She held out the package. "This is for you both, a small wedding gift." Rebecca unwrapped the brown paper carefully to reveal a hand-stitched quilt, small enough to serve as a lap blanket rather than a bed covering. "It's beautiful," she breathed, admiring the intricate pattern. "For those cold winter evenings," Mrs. Foster explained with a knowing smile. "Though I suspect you two will find other ways to stay warm." Rebecca blushed at the older woman's frank implication, but couldn't help laughing. "Thank you, Maddie, for everything these past months. Your friendship has meant the world to me." "And yours to me, Mrs. Foster replied, patting Rebecca's hand. "Now go claim that husband of yours for a dance before the fiddler gets too deep in his cups to play." The evening passed in a blur of music, laughter, and congratulations. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit around the ranch yard, casting a golden glow over the continuing celebrations. When Daniel finally led Rebecca to the wagon that would take them to their home, his cabin, soon to be expanded as promised stars filled the vast Montana sky, a celestial blessing on their union. The journey passed in comfortable silence, Daniel's arm around Rebecca's shoulders as they shared the wagon seat. When they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, firelight glowing warmly through its windows, Rebecca felt a surge of emotion. "Someone's lit the fire," she observed, surprised since they had expected to return to a cold hearth. Daniel smiled mysteriously. "Ask Jim from the ranch to ride ahead. Wanted everything perfect for you tonight." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. "It already is perfect," she assured him, leaning into his solid warmth. When they reached the cabin, Daniel surprised her by lifting her into his arms before crossing the threshold. "Tradition," he explained with a grin as she laughed in delight. Inside, Rebecca discovered more surprises: fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, new curtains at the windows, and a proper rocking chair to replace the rough stool Daniel had always used. "Wedding gifts from the ranch hands," Daniel explained, seeing her questioning look. "They've been smuggling things over for weeks when you weren't looking." Tears threatened again at this evidence of their community's support and affection. "I never expected to find such kindness here after losing father," Rebecca admitted, turning in a slow circle to take in their home with new eyes. "Frontier folk look after their own," Daniel reminded her, echoing his words from months ago. "And you're one of us now, Rebecca Irwin." Rebecca Irwin. Her new name sounded right, felt right, as though she had been moving toward this identity her entire life without realizing it. "I am, aren't I?" she marveled, meeting her husband's loving gaze. Later, as they lay entwined in what was now their bed, Rebecca's head resting on Daniel's chest, she marveled at the journey that had brought them together. From that desperate flight through snow, barefoot and certain of death, to this moment of perfect contentment. "What are you thinking?" Daniel murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her bare shoulder. "That sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best," Rebecca replied honestly. "If the Blackwells hadn't come that night, if I hadn't been forced to flee, we might never have met." Daniel's arms tightened around her protectively. "I'd prefer a different beginning for us, one that didn't involve your suffering or your father's death, but I can't regret where we ended up." Rebecca lifted her head to look into his face, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. "Nor can I love you, Daniel Irwin, more than I thought possible when we first met." "And I love you, Rebecca Irwin," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "more than I have words to express." Words became unnecessary then, as they found other ways to communicate their love, their commitment, their joy in having found each other against impossible odds. Outside, the Montana night continued its timeless progression, coyotes calling in the distance, the wind whispering through pine needles, stars wheeling across the vast sky. Within the small cabin, two lives that fate had thrown together now forged a shared future, their love a beacon of hope in a wild and sometimes brutal land. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the yard as Rebecca hung laundry on the line stretched between the house and the barn. From her vantage point, she could see her 3-year-old son Thomas, named for her father, chasing butterflies near the garden fence, his chubby legs pumping with determination. Nearby, Daniel knelt in the dirt, patiently showing their 5-year-old daughter Sarah how to plant bean seeds in neat rows. The little girl's dark head bent close to her father's as she concentrated on the task, her small fingers carefully placing each seed exactly as instructed. Rebecca paused, clothes basket propped against her hip, to savor the sight of her family. The past 5 years had brought changes beyond anything she could have imagined that snowy night when she'd fled her father's cabin. The small homestead Daniel had promised had become reality, 60 acres of good land, with water rights to the creek that ran along its eastern boundary. The cabin had been expanded as planned, with a proper kitchen and parlor downstairs and 3 bedrooms above, though they only used 2 so far. A barn housed their growing collection of livestock, and fenced pastures contained horses and cattle bearing the double-I brand Daniel had registered in their first year of marriage. More important than these material accomplishments was the family they'd created. Sarah had arrived exactly 9 months after their wedding night, a fact that had caused much good-natured teasing from their friends at the Broken Spur. Thomas had followed 2 years later, his birth coinciding with the completion of their expanded home. The sound of an approaching rider drew Rebecca's attention. Shielding her eyes against the bright June sunshine, she recognized Marshall Cooper's distinctive figure long before he reached the yard. James. She called, using the first name he'd insisted upon once they'd become friends rather than merely acquaintances. "What brings you out this way?" Cooper dismounted, tipping his hat in greeting. "Mrs. Irwin, looking well as always." He nodded toward Daniel and the children. "Came with news I thought you'd want to hear in person." Something in his tone made Rebecca set down her basket. "Important news, the kind that brings closure," Cooper replied, his weathered face serious yet satisfied. "Is Daniel available to join us?" Rebecca called to her husband, who spoke briefly to Sarah before rising and crossing the yard, Thomas now perched on his shoulders. "Marshall," Daniel greeted, extending his hand. "What brings you to the double-I?" Cooper shook the offered hand. "News from Wyoming territory. The Blackwells are dead, all 4 of them." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as memories of that terrible night flooded back her father's body on the cabin floor, the desperate flight through snow, the pain of frozen feet. Daniel's free arm came around her waist, steadying her as it had so many times before. "You're certain?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled for the children's benefit. Cooper nodded grimly. "No doubt. They tried to rob a bank in Cheyenne last month. Didn't realize the town had hired extra deputies after a previous holdup. Got themselves cornered in a blind alley behind the livery stable." He paused. "They didn't surrender. And they've been positively identified," Rebecca pressed, needing absolute certainty. "Luther Blackwell's body was shipped to his brother in Missouri for burial. The other 3 are in unmarked graves in Wyoming." Cooper's expression softened as he regarded Rebecca. "It's truly over, Rebecca. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore." The weight that lifted from her shoulders was one Rebecca hadn't fully realized she still carried. Despite the years of safety, the distance from her father's murder, some small part of her had continued to fear the Blackwells might someday return, might threaten the precious family she and Daniel had built. Thank you for coming to tell us in person, Daniel said, shifting Thomas to a more comfortable position on his shoulders. Would you stay for dinner? Rebecca's made her famous rabbit stew. Cooper accepted the invitation, and the conversation moved to more pleasant topics as they moved toward the house, the upcoming Harvest Festival in Silverdale, the new schoolhouse being built, which Sarah would attend next year. Cooper's recent engagement to the widow who ran the town's small hotel. As Rebecca prepared the meal, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. The grief of losing her father would never fully disappear, but it had softened with time and the creation of new joys. Her aunt in Boston still wrote regularly, expressing both understanding about Rebecca's decision to remain in Montana and standing invitations to visit when the children were older. Life on the frontier remained challenging. Harsh winters, the constant work of maintaining a homestead, the isolation during bad weather, yet Rebecca had discovered depths of strength within herself she'd never known existed. Moreover, she'd found a partner who valued that strength, who saw her as an equal in their shared endeavor rather than merely a helpmeet. Later that evening, after Cooper had departed and the children were tucked into bed, Rebecca joined Daniel on the porch. The summer twilight lingered, painting the distant mountains with hues of purple and gold as stars began appearing in the darkening eastern sky. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel said, drawing her close against his side as they sat on the porch swing he'd built for their 3rd anniversary. Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable in the familiar contours of his body. "I was thinking about how complete things feel now, knowing the Blackwells can never harm anyone else, never threaten our family." Daniel pressed a kiss to her temple. "Does it help with the memories?" "Knowing they're gone, some," Rebecca admitted. "But the best remedy for those dark memories has always been you, us, what we've built together." Daniel's arm tightened around her. "From the moment I found you in that snow, I knew my life had changed forever. I just never imagined how much better it would become." Rebecca smiled, thinking of how far they'd traveled from that desperate day, not just in time, but in growth, in love, in the family they'd created. "Remember how you wrapped my feet that first day? How gentle you were, even though we were strangers. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever met," Daniel replied, his voice deep with emotion. "Running barefoot through snow to escape killers, I couldn't imagine the courage that took." "Not courage," Rebecca corrected him. "Just the will to survive. The real courage came later, choosing to stay when Boston seemed safer, building a life here despite the risks, loving you even knowing what I might lose." Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the fading light. "Any regrets about not going to Boston?" Rebecca shook her head without hesitation. "Not one. I found where I belong, Daniel, who I belong with." She gestured toward the house where their children slept peacefully. "What we have here, it's everything I never knew I wanted until I found it." Satisfaction spread across Daniel's features as he pulled her closer for a kiss that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made Rebecca's heart race. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Daniel whispered against her lips, "Not bad for a ranch hand who once found a half-frozen woman in the snow." Rebecca laughed softly, joy bubbling up within her at the simple pleasure of being exactly where she belonged. "Not bad at all, Mr. Irwin. Not bad at all." As darkness settled fully over their homestead, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms. Two souls who had found in each other not just love but salvation, healing, and the promise of a future brighter than either could have imagined on that snowy day that had brought them together. The Double I Ranch flourished over the years as Daniel and Rebecca worked side by side to build their dream. More children joined their family, another son, James, named after Marshall Cooper, who had become a dear friend, and twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, who arrived as a surprise blessing when Sarah was 12. The Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, bringing changes both large and small to their lives. Silverdale grew from a small settlement into a proper town with a bank, a school, and eventually a railroad spur that connected them more firmly to the wider world. The Broken Spur expanded under Harold Jenkins's son's management, and the Double I established itself as one of the most respected smaller ranches in the county. Through it all, Rebecca never forgot her extraordinary journey from Boston society girl to homesteader's daughter to frontier wife and mother. The memories of that desperate flight through snow, of Daniel finding her when all hope seemed lost, of his careful tending of her frozen feet, remained vivid even as decades passed. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their grown children and a growing brood of grandchildren, Rebecca found Daniel standing alone on the porch of the home they'd built together, gazing out at the land that had sustained them through good years and lean ones alike. "Any regrets, Mr. Irwin?" she asked softly, echoing the question he'd asked her so many years before. Daniel turned, his hair now silver but his green eyes still bright with the same love that had sustained them through 3 decades of shared life. "Only that we can't do it all again from the beginning," he replied, drawing her into arms that had never failed to make her feel safe, cherished, and exactly where she belonged. As the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca leaned into her husband's embrace and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment, a journey that began with desperate footsteps in the snow and led to a lifetime of love deeper and more enduring than she could have ever imagined.